Love and chocolate, two delightfully delicious things. But unrequited love, now that can lead someone to do dreadful things. Perhaps even commit murder. You're on a day trip to the lovely seaside town of Brighton. You explore the pier and indulge in some sea bathing. You decide to round off a perfect day with a tasty chocolate treat from a fancy chocolatier. You excitedly pop the beautiful chocolate cream in your mouth and bite down, expecting sweet deliciousness. But instead, it tastes odd, metallic, bitter. You quickly spit it out. However, it's too late. Within the hour, you become violently ill. Your throat burns, you feel nauseous, you're hot, and your whole body begins to stiffen. It is the longest night of your life. You are the victim of a woman whose obsession with a man that she cannot have leads to murder and an attempt to poison an entire town. Now, today's story is going to be a little bit longer than usual, so grab a beverage and a snack. I'd advise against chocolate though, and let's begin. As I'm sure you've guessed, our story takes us to Brighton, a seaside town in England. The year is 1867, and Brighton was the place to be. You see, sea bathing was all the rage back then. It could cure everything. Broken bone? Sea bathing. Got a little bit of gout? Sea bathing. Now, this wasn't just your ordinary trip to the beach though. Oh no, there were special bathing machines. These were changing rooms on wheels that were dragged out into the water to protect your modesty until you could enter the water so no one could see your rather heavily clothed body. I mean, that would be far too scandalous. The leading lady of our story, Christiana Edmunds, and her mother, Anne Edmunds, had come here in the hopes of a second fresh start. They moved into rented rooms at 15 Marlborough Place, right in the centre of Brighton. Though the house was large, it was nothing like the luxury that they were accustomed to. They had once lived in Hawley Square in Margate, another seaside town, and this was one of the most sought-after areas in Margate, with beautifully luxurious houses that had an equally beautiful seaside view. Christiana's father, William Edmunds, had been a well-respected architect, designing many notable structures, such as Levy's Bazaar and Trinity Church in Dover. His profession meant that he could provide a very good life, complete with servants for his wife Anne and their 4 children, Christiana, Mary, Louisa, and Arthur. The children were very well educated, with the girls sent off to private boarding school, where they would learn the accomplishments. But they couldn't be too educated now. You see, many doctors believed that if women studied too much, they wouldn't be able to have children, and what man would want them then? On the other hand, Arthur's schooling prepared him for university and entrance into a respectable profession. Unfortunately, their father William began showing signs of what was known at the time as general paralysis of the insane. We now know that this disorder was caused by late-stage syphilis, so it would seem that William had been playing away from home. Typical. He gradually stopped leaving the house. Soon he could no longer work. He became violent and had delusions that he was wealthy beyond compare. His condition worsened until Anne just couldn't take it anymore, and so with a heavy heart she had him committed to Southall Park Asylum. Sadly, William would never recover and died a few years later on the 15th of March 1847. There was such stigma around mental illness at this time, and William's sudden death in an asylum no less dealt a huge blow to the family's reputation. This was meant to be an exciting time in Christiana's life, when she would come out into society ready for some romance and courtship, resulting in a spiffy new husband. But instead, it was a time of immense sadness and uncertainty. With a taint of mental illness in her family, who would want to marry her now? Cruel gossip and rumours began to spread throughout the town, so much so that the poor Edmunds just couldn't take it anymore, and so Anne decided that they should sell their valuables and move to Canterbury. A new start would be good for them all. Unfortunately, tragedy would follow them here too. Christiana was really badly affected by the death of her father. She began to burst into her mother's room at night time, exclaiming that she couldn't breathe, and she would also have attacks of paralysis on one side of her body. Of course, Anne was very worried about her daughter, and so took her to a doctor for treatment. She was diagnosed with hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for things wrong with women, the uterus being the cause. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, which means uterus. Now, apparently, throughout history, many people believed that the uterus was an animal that wandered around the woman's body, causing all kinds of maladies. Unfortunately, it would seem that no one in the family was safe from tragedy. Her brother Arthur started having seizures and also violent outbursts. He was diagnosed with epilepsy. Back then, they had some interesting ideas about epilepsy, namely that it was caused by too much self-pleasuring. Anyway, it's now thought that he likely had congenital syphilis. His mental condition quickly deteriorated, and, like his father, he ended up being committed to an asylum, where sadly he too would lose his life. Next, Christiana's sister Louisa would also suffer from hysteria and depression. Her fits of hysteria were so bad that she once attempted to throw herself out of an upstairs window, but luckily a servant was able to stop her. On the 28th of June, 1867, sadly, Louisa collapsed outside of her home and died at the age of 36. According to her death certificate, the cause of death was heavy periods, effusion, and exhaustion, though it's now thought that she was also suffering from congenital syphilis. Understandably, the losses were far too great for Christiana and her mother to bear, and so a second new start was in order, in Brighton. Now, after that little detour through Christiana's life, we're back in Brighton in 1867. The owners of Christiana's new rented accommodation introduced her to Dr. Charles Beard, who lived nearby. Little did they know that this would lead to a deadly obsession. Dr. Beard became Christiana's physician. He treated her for her newly diagnosed neuralgia, and the two became fast friends. He regaled her with his stories of his time in the military, which she thoroughly enjoyed listening to. Christiana just couldn't get enough of the wonderful Dr. Beard. She began bombarding him with letter after letter after letter, sometimes up to 3 a week. He was all Christiana could think or talk about, and she did everything she could to be in his presence, and was constantly coming up with new ways to try and win his affections. Now, I need to point out that Dr. Beard was a happily married man, with 3 children no less. However, he didn't dissuade her attention, but he also didn't seem to encourage it either. At the very least, he was very flattered that she had taken such an interest in him. This obsession caused quite a shift in her personality, so much so that even the landlords had taken notice. Her mother was becoming increasingly worried with her behaviour. You see, Christiana was now 42. It was around this time that her father had started showing signs of mental illness. Even more concerning was that Christiana was approaching the menopause, which Victorian physicians had linked to many mental disorders. A leading physician at the time had claimed that the menopause could even drive a woman to murder. Christiana began to think to herself, if only Dr. Beard wasn't married. If his wife Emily was out of the picture, they could finally be together. So cunningly, she started to befriend Emily, gaining her trust to the point that they frequently visited each other's houses. Emily was blissfully unaware of Christiana's obsession with her husband and the evil that she was capable of. One evening in September 1870, Dr. Beard was away on one of his many work trips, leaving Emily all alone at home with the children. There was a knock at the door. It was Christiana with a beautiful bag of chocolates for Maynard, the renowned chocolatier.
Uh-oh, I don't like where this is going.
I know. Christiana was taken into the drawing room by one of the servants, and Emily was glad to see her. She could do with the company. I mean, it was lonely without her husband there. Christiana explained that she had bought some chocolates for the children as a nice little treat, and Emily thought this was very kind. But here is where things start to get a little bit strange. Clearly, Christiana just couldn't wait to enact her plan. She sat down, took out one of the chocolate creams, and suddenly shoved it into Emily's mouth. Emily, of course, was very confused, and then the taste hit her. It was awful, metallic and bitter. She quickly ran out of the room and spat it out. She regained her composure and returned to the drawing room. Christiana didn't try to explain herself or anything like that. She was a bit flustered and said that something had come up and she had to leave. That night, poor Emily fell really, really ill, a terrible upset tummy and lots of salivation. She wondered if it was the chocolate cream. It did taste really awful. Perhaps it was a bad batch. I mean, Christiana wouldn't try to harm her, would she? Later that month, Dr. Beard returned back home, and Emily, of course, told him of the strange event with Christiana and the chocolate. He was furious. He put two and two together and knew that Christiana had tried to poison his wife. He realised that Christiana's obsession with him had gone too far. He rushed off to confront her. He demanded to know why she'd tried to poison his wife. Christiana was shocked at the accusation. She assured Dr. Beard that she would never, ever do such a thing. It was all just a big misunderstanding. She herself had fallen ill from the bad batch of chocolates. Dr. Beard saw right through her though, and let her know that there was a new instrument, the spectroscope, and this could detect poison in animal tissue. Christiana pleaded with Dr. Beard. How could he think something like that of her? Dr. Beard realised that he wasn't going to get a confession out of her, and so he left, wanting nothing more to do with her. Though he couldn't be 100% sure that it was Christiana that poisoned the chocolate. Back then, many companies cut corners and put all manner of dangerous things into their food to try and keep the costs down. Christiana's plan had failed miserably. Emily was still very, very much alive, and her beloved Dr. Beard now saw her as a monster. She was distraught. She had to find a way to exonerate herself and win back Dr. Beard's affections. Now this is the turning point, the point where Christiana's reign of terror truly begins. She sets out to make it look like Maynard's, the chocolatier, was selling dodgy chocolates to everyone in town. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 meant that poisons and dangerous drugs couldn't just be given out willy-nilly anymore. Oh no, you had to know the pharmacist well or have a witness that knew you both. You also had to enter your details into a poison book. So this made things a little bit harder for Christiana. On the 28th of March 1871, she went to the pharmacist, Mr. Garrett, to secure some strychnine for her plan. Under the guise of Mrs. Wood, she told the pharmacist that her and her husband were much annoyed by some cats and so needed to kill them. Mr. Garrett was reluctant to give her such a strong poison, but Christiana assured him that no harm could possibly happen. She had no children, it would just be her and her husband handling the poison. Mr. Garrett thought about it a bit, and then he agreed to sell it to her, if she brought a witness. He suggested a milliner that lived close by and told Christiana to go and get her. So she put on a veil and headed over to the milliner's shop. Not really sure what she was going to say. I mean, it's quite an awkward thing to ask, really. She introduced herself as Mrs. Wood and made a little bit of small talk, and also bought a veil from her to try and butter her up. Then she worked up the courage to ask her request. She explained that she needed poison for the purposes of stuffing a bird.
Wait, what happened to the cats?
I know, right? She really needs to get her story straight. Anyway, she explained that she needed a witness so Mr. Garrett would sell the poison to her. The milliner thought it was a little bit odd. She'd never had a request like this before. But she agreed, and so the two of them headed back to Mr. Garrett's shop. And soon, Christiana was armed with enough strychnine to kill many, many people. With a veil covering her face, Christiana, a horrible woman, she began approaching children and offering them poisoned chocolates. Many of the children, of course, accepted them, and so fell ill. But luckily, they all made a full recovery. A silver lining is the fact that the chocolates tasted so awful that thankfully a lot of the children just spat them out. Then Christiana started leaving poison bags of chocolates all around town with the name Maynard very clearly emblazoned on them. She hoped that people would eat them and get sick, and they did. The absolute boldness of this woman is on another level. She visited the home of a child that she'd poisoned to see if anyone in the household had taken ill. The mother of the child thought that Christiana was a district worker and told her that yes, her daughter had taken ill after being given chocolates by a strange woman wearing a veil, and that they were trying to hunt down this evil woman. Christiana was very lucky that that child wasn't at home to recognise her and identify her. This was too close of a call for Christiana, and so she would try out a new tactic. She started hiring young boys to procure chocolates from Maynard's for her. When the boys would return with the chocolates, she would switch them with ones that she had already poisoned, making sure that the boys were distracted so that they wouldn't see the old switcheroo. Then she would tell the boys that they had bought the wrong chocolates and ask them to exchange them for another type. This was quite clever. She wouldn't be anywhere near the shop, so no one would suspect her. And now, the poisoned chocolates would be mixed into Maynard's supply. so then they would be directly distributed to unsuspecting customers. To cast even more suspicion on Maynard's, she made a complaint directly to the confectioner himself. She told him that on a number of occasions she had fallen ill after eating their chocolates and suggested that a chemical analysis be carried out on them. She took the chocolates to a chemist for an analysis, which will become important later on. Eventually, it was time to retire that character of Mrs. Wood that she had invented. This was so that she wouldn't arouse suspicion with the bucket loads of strychnine that she'd been buying. She told Mr. Garrett, the pharmacist, that her and her husband were moving away and that she needed some strychnine to kill a dog that was too ill and old to bring with them. Now, she didn't have a dog, but a fellow lodger did.
Oh no, she's not going to do what I think she's going to do, is she?
She does. She poisons the poor dog. God knows why. Maybe she was testing out different dosages or was just getting more and more unhinged with time. I'm afraid that here is where the story takes an even darker turn. Charles Miller was on a much-needed holiday in Brighton. He popped into Maynard's and asked for a bag of their finest chocolate creams. He had a few of the chocolates himself, gave some to his brother, and one to his 4-year-old nephew, Sidney. Charles started to feel extremely ill, to the point where he couldn't even stand up, and so a surgeon who lived nearby was sent for. The surgeon examined him and was very perplexed by his symptoms. But he assured him that the chocolates were not to blame, and he could carry on eating them. Oh, if only the doctor hadn't told him that. After a while, Charles started to feel better, and then he gave another chocolate to Sidney. Shortly after this, Sidney began to cry, and then he started convulsing. His panicked mother quickly called a surgeon and a doctor who rushed to the scene, and unlike that doctor from earlier, they realised that this was a case of poisoning. They quickly requested an emetic from a nearby pharmacy. Unfortunately, Sidney died in the doctor's arms before the emetic could arrive. Because the death was suspicious, the police were contacted, and Charles made sure to give samples of the chocolates to the police. As part of the post-mortem, Sidney's stomach was removed and an expert was consulted to look for signs of poisoning. A colour reaction test was performed, and lo and behold, it indicated the presence of strychnine. Word of Sidney's death started to spread around town, and Christiana was invited to the inquest. Why? Because the police had heard that she had had Maynard's chocolates analysed by a chemist. She felt no remorse for Sidney's death, only elation for this invitation to the inquest. She could now really drag Maynard's name through the dirt and win back the affections of Dr. Beard. At the inquest, Christiana played the part of a victim to a T. Oh, the suffering, the illness that seized her after eating Maynard's chocolates. Oh, how that tyrant Mr. Maynard didn't believe her claims, and she was forced to seek chemical analysis of the chocolates. The jury lapped up her story. But Mr. Maynard then gave his testimony, and it was clear that there was no way that he had poisoned the chocolates. Perhaps it was the manufacturer. But the manufacturer didn't keep any poisons in the factory. However, they did have a vermin problem that they had hired an exterminator for. Perhaps this was the source. In the end, the jury decided that the cause was some misadventure at the manufacturer. No criminal charges were made and Mr. Maynard was found innocent. After the inquest, Christiana felt that this was an opportune time to reach out to her beloved Dr. Beard. She wrote to him telling him all about the inquest, and perhaps trying to incite a little bit of jealousy, describing the array of gentlemen looking at her, very rosy and frightened as she was. She wrote of how much she longed for him to visit, and signed the letter off with a long, long kiss. This attempt to rekindle Dr. Beard's affections did not work. She received no reply and he didn't come to see her. My goodness, this woman, she then started to bombard poor Sidney's grieving parents with anonymous letters urging them to take further action against Maynard's. To no avail though. Instead, they gave the letters to the police. Eventually, Dr. Beard would pay Christiana a visit, but not the kind she had hoped for. He came to tell her that he wanted nothing more to do with her, that these letters they had to stop. And then he made the revelation that he had shown the letters to his wife, and this threw Christiana over the edge. She hired a young boy to deliver a forged letter to the pharmacist, Mr. Garrett. In it, she pretended to be a coroner. She asked for him to send his poison book, which he duly provided, and she then proceeded to rip out the pages surrounding her entries, and then she sent it back. Not really sure why, maybe to throw suspicion on what was contained in the ripped out pages. Who knows? Mr. Garrett started to wise up and get a little bit suspicious. About time. So she had to try and trick another pharmacist instead. She forged more letters to this new pharmacist, pretending to be a pharmacist herself, and through these means managed to secure a whole load of arsenic. She made up several boxes of delightful treats: peaches, strawberries, cakes, candied fruit. Lovely. And then she stuffed them to the brim with arsenic, even dusting some of the fruits with strychnine for good measure. This was not a subtle poisoning attempt. She sent these boxes all around town to prominent people in the community, including Emily Beard. Now, I'm not sure whether she just lost the plot or what at this point, because I thought the whole point of her poisoning spree was to redeem herself in the eyes of Dr. Beard. But then she also sent a box to herself to divert suspicion, which is kind of clever, I guess. Each of these parcels of death came with a little handwritten note, which would be her undoing. As you can imagine, chaos ensued. It was actually the servants that got sick rather than their intended victims, all suffering from the classic signs of arsenic poisoning: burning throat, vomiting, diarrhoea, and trembling. Doctors were called to the various houses, and they realised that something fishy was going on. The police were alerted, and samples of the treats and also the victim's vomit were taken for testing. The police and a doctor were also called to Christiana's house, because she too was a victim of this whole poison scandal. When they arrived, she was lying on the couch pretending to be very fragile and ill. She and her mother recounted how they had received an anonymous parcel with tainted treats. As the police officer was leaving, Christiana remarked, "How very strange. I feel certain you'll never find it out." If they didn't suspect her before, they certainly suspected her now. The police put out a request for information relating to the poisoning, and Dr. Beard responded, implicating Christiana. And so, Christiana was arrested to be charged with the attempted murder of Emily Beard. During the court proceedings, the true extent of Christiana's horrific crimes would come to light. Mr. Garrett testified that Christiana had bought poison from him under the false name of Mrs. Wood, and also presented the forged notes that he had received. The police had managed to track down some of the boys who had been hired to deliver the notes, and one of them recognised Christiana as the lady that had hired him, and pointed this out to the court. Christiana thought that she had gone unnoticed when she was leaving her bags of poisoned chocolates all around town, but she hadn't. A few of the victims did see her and they testified against her. Some of the children that accepted chocolates from her also came forward to testify against her. The police had also tracked down the young boys that had bought the chocolates for Christiana. They testified that she would always tell them that they bought the wrong ones and send them to exchange them for another type. Analysis of the fruit taken earlier revealed that it was literally stuffed with arsenic, and the vomit contained dangerous levels of the stuff too. A handwriting expert was brought in, and they matched Christiana's handwriting to the forged notes that were sent to the pharmacist, to the address labels and the notes that were accompanying the boxes of tainted treats, and to the letters that were sent to poor Sydney's parents. This was the final nail in the coffin. Christiana was put on trial 2 months later. Her defence tried to plead that she was not guilty on grounds of insanity, but after an hour of deliberation, the jury pronounced her guilty of the murder of Sydney Barker, and she was sentenced to death. So, what did Christiana do? Well, she yelled out that she was pregnant. If you were indeed pregnant, you would get a stay of execution. But this was something rather easy to check, and she wasn't pregnant, so that was the end of that. While Christiana awaited her execution, there was much discussion about the verdict. A petition was drafted for her pardon on the grounds of insanity, and interestingly, this was signed by 2 of her victims. A psychiatric evaluation was carried out, and Christiana was declared insane. She was shipped off to Broadmoor Asylum at the expense of the city of Canterbury. Christiana certainly had her priorities right. She wanted to look beautiful, and so she arrived at the asylum wearing a large amount of false hair, false teeth, and rouge on her cheeks. She would live out the rest of her days at Broadmoor until she died of senile debility on the 19th of September 1907. If you'd like some more curious, dark and mysterious tales, take a look at some of my other videos. Stay safe, don't accept chocolates from strange ladies wearing veils, and I hope you have a magnificent day.